In previous videos, we have discussed the reabsorption and secretion in various parts of the nephron. In this video, we will discuss how this reabsorption and secretion is regulated. So there are various factors that regulate tubular reabsorption and secretion. The first factor is glomerulotubular balance. Then we have the peritubular physical forces. Then we have the role of different hormones like aldosterone, angiotensin II, antidiuretic hormone, atrial natriuretic factor, parathyroid hormone. Then we have the nervous factors, which includes the role of the sympathetic nervous system, the effect of arterial pressure, and the osmotic factors. We will discuss them one by one. So the first and the most important one is the glomerulotubular balance. What this states is that whenever the filtration across the glomerular capillaries increases, this will also lead to marked increase in the urinary excretion. But in actual, this does not happen. What happens is that whenever the filtration across the glomerular capillaries increases, this also leads to increase in reabsorption, so that the excretion rate is not increased markedly and there is no loss of excess fluid from the body. How this happens is that whenever the filtration increases, so this leads to increased fluid into the Bowman's capsule, and in the peritubular capillaries, the concentration of the plasma proteins increases. Actually, the plasma proteins get more and more concentrated when more and more fluid is filtering from the glomerulus. So because of concentration of the plasma proteins in the peritubular capillaries, what they are going to cause, they are going to exert more osmotic force, and they are going to cause more reabsorption of fluid or more bulk flow of fluid from the tubular lumen into the peritubular capillaries. In this way, whenever the filtration is going to increase, concentration of plasma proteins increases, leading to increased reabsorption in the peritubular capillaries. So this is termed as glomerulotubular balance, and this helps in preventing excess loss of fluid through the urine. Next important factor that regulate tubular reabsorption and secretion is the Starling forces. The Starling forces that exist across the peritubular capillaries. So these are the tubular cells, the interstitium, and the peritubular capillaries. We have already discussed the Starling forces. You have to remember that the Starling forces across the peritubular capillaries are in the favor of reabsorption. That is, they are favoring the reabsorption of fluid from the interstitium into the peritubular capillaries. This is also called as bulk flow. So if there is any change in these pressures, they are going to affect reabsorption and secretion. Let's suppose if the plasma colloid osmotic pressure increases, then there will be more reabsorption of fluid from the interstitium into the peritubular capillaries, just as we have discussed in glomerulotubular balance. And if this pressure decreases, the plasma colloid osmotic pressure decreases, then there will be decreased reabsorption. Let's move to the next step, the hormonal control of tubular reabsorption and secretion. This is very important. So the first hormone that we are going to discuss is angiotensin II. How and in which parts of the nephron angiotensin II is going to act? Let's see that. You have to remember that when angiotensin II is released in the body, whenever there is dehydration due to any reason, whenever there is loss of blood volume, whenever there is decreased blood pressure, this leads to decreased renal perfusion pressure and release of renin. Renin is released from the kidneys, and it leads to the conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin I. This is converted into angiotensin II inside the lungs by angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin II, whenever the levels of angiotensin II increases in the body, it is going to exert the following effects. Number one, it is a potent vasoconstrictor, so it is going to cause vasoconstriction that increases the peripheral resistance. Angiotensin II also causes the constriction of efferent arterioles that we have discussed before. Angiotensin II also leads to the formation of aldosterone, or increase the secretion of aldosterone from the suprarenal gland. We will discuss what this is going to cause. Okay, angiotensin II on the kidneys, it is going to increase the reabsorption of sodium and from different pumps. Let's discuss how this happens. So all these factors are collectively going to bring back the blood pressure or the blood volume back towards normal. This is a very important regulatory step. for the regulation of blood pressure inside the body, for the retention of salts and water inside the body. So let's see how angiotensin II acts on the kidneys and on which part. So this is the proximal convoluted tubule. We have discussed how reabsorption and secretion takes place in this part in very detail. So what happens that on the basal side we have the receptors for angiotensin II. Angiotensin II, from the blood it comes and it acts or binds with its receptor. What happens after that is that angiotensin II alters the level of cyclic AMP and increases the function of certain transporters inside the proximal convoluted tubule. So these transporters whose activity is going to increase are, number one, the sodium potassium ATPase pump that is located on the basolateral membrane. So whenever the activity of this pump increases, it is going to cause more and more reabsorption of sodium into the peritubular capillaries. Second important pump on which angiotensin II acts or increases its activity include the sodium bicarb cotransporter, again located on the basal side. So when this activity of this pump increases, again there is more reabsorption of sodium. But along with that, you can also see there is reabsorption of bicarb as well. Third important pump is the sodium hydrogen countertransporter that is located on the apical surface. So you can see that there is reabsorption of sodium from all these pumps. So ultimately angiotensin II is going to cause more reabsorption of sodium by acting on the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. Along with that, you can also see that it is increasing the secretion of hydrogen and increasing the reabsorption of new bicarbonate. So this is important to remember that whenever the levels of angiotensin II increases in the body, this is going to cause mild alkalosis. Depending on the levels of angiotensin II and the activity of these pumps, this alkalosis can be increased. So along with retention of sodium and water, it is also going to cause alkalosis. Next important hormone that regulates the renal reabsorption and secretion is aldosterone. Aldosterone acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubules. Again, we have discussed that there are two types of cells located in this region. One is the principal cell and other is the intercalated cell. So aldosterone is going to act on both these cells. Let's discuss what actually happens on the principal cells. So we have the sodium potassium ATPase pump on the basal side that leads to the reabsorption of sodium and the secretion of potassium. On the apical side, we have a special channels which are called the epithelial sodium channels. This leads to the reabsorption of sodium because of the gradient created by this pump. And we have another channel which is called as the potassium channel. So because of the reabsorption of sodium, there is a negativity over here that leads to secretion of potassium. Okay, this is what is happening in the principal cells. So on the receptors of aldosterone are located inside the principal cells. Whenever there are increased levels of aldosterone in the body, the aldosterone is secreted from the suprarenal gland. This aldosterone then comes through the circulation and bind with its intracellular receptor. The hormone receptor complex is activated. This complex enters into the nucleus and binds with its hormone response element that then leads to increased transcription and increased translation, that is formation of new proteins. So which new proteins are formed? These are the proteins, the epithelial sodium channels, the potassium channels, and this transporter. So aldosterone is going to increase synthesis of all these proteins. So when these proteins are formed, they are going to be embedded into the basal and apical membranes. When more of these proteins are located over there, they are going to cause more reabsorption of sodium and more secretion of potassium. So the function of aldosterone is that it is going to increase the reabsorption of sodium in the body, and along with the sodium there is increased osmosis of water. So sodium and water are going to be reabsorbed, while aldosterone is going to cause increased secretion of potassium into the tubular lumen. So there is loss of potassium from the body. Along with acting on the principal cells, the aldosterone also acts on the alpha intercalated cells, and in the alpha intercalated cell it is going to increase this hydrogen transporter. So hydrogen ATPase pump is synthesized more, and again it leads to more secretion of hydrogen into the tubular lumen. In this way, the net effect of aldosterone is going to be increased reabsorption of sodium and water, while increased secretion of hydrogen and potassium. These were the physiological effects of these hormones. Let's suppose now if there are abnormal high levels of aldosterone in the body due to any tumor or any other cause. Whenever the aldosterone increases abnormally inside the body, what it is going to cause is that again these physiological effects are going to be exaggerated. So it is going to retain more and more sodium inside the body, and thus more and more water is reabsorbed inside the body, leading to increase in blood pressure and the development of hypertension. Similarly, it is also going to increase the secretion of potassium from the body or loss of potassium from the body, leading to hypokalemia. And third, it is also going to cause loss of hydrogen ions from the body, leading to alkalosis. Whenever there is loss of hydrogen from the body, there is reabsorption of bicarbonate, and that leads to a state of alkalosis. So there is a syndrome which is called Conn's syndrome, in which there is excess release of aldosterone in the body, and that leads to sodium and water retention, hypertension, hypokalemia, and alkalosis. Opposite effects are going to happen when the levels of aldosterone decreases inside the body. So there is a condition which is called Addison's disease, in which the levels of aldosterone decreases in the body, and the exact opposite of this happen. Sodium is going to be lost from the body, water is going to be lost, and that leads to a state of hypotension, and increased reabsorption of potassium will lead to hyperkalemia, and again increased reabsorption of hydrogen will lead to acidosis. Now there are certain factors that regulate or control the secretion of aldosterone. The first and the most important factor among all of them is the increased potassium inside the body. So whenever there is hyperkalemia, the secretion of aldosterone is stimulated, that then regulates the reabsorption or secretion of potassium. Then the second important factor that controls secretion of aldosterone is angiotensin II, that we have already discussed. Then we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone ACTH, that also increases aldosterone secretion. Factors that decrease aldosterone secretion includes ANF and increased sodium concentration. So all these factors are going to regulate actually the levels of aldosterone, that further regulates sodium, potassium, hydrogen, and water inside the body. Let's move to the next hormone that is important in regulation of tubular reabsorption and secretion. This is antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone again acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubules and the collecting ducts as well. In the principal cells, as we have discussed the reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium, what is going to happen that in the tubular lumen we have water. So this part is actually impermeable to water. So water is not reabsorbed under normal conditions. Whenever there is a need of more water inside the body, like whenever there is dehydration or there is increased osmolarity inside the body, it leads to the stimulation of receptors, the thirst receptors or the osmoreceptors located in the organum musculosum, that further leads to the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. So we have special receptors located on the basal side of the principal cells, which are called the V2 receptors. These receptors are there for antidiuretic hormone, which is also called as vasopressin. Inside these cells we have special vesicles containing these proteins, which are called aquaporins. So there are aquaporin 2, aquaporin 3, and aquaporin 4. What happens that with the release of antidiuretic hormone, it binds with its receptors and leads to the intracellular activation of cyclic AMP. Increased levels of cyclic AMP will lead to the activation of protein kinase A. Protein kinase A then leads to the phosphorylation of these proteins and exocytosis and embedding of these proteins on the apical as well as on the basal membrane. So the aquaporin 2 channels are embedded on the apical side, while the aquaporin 3 and aquaporin 4 channels are embedded on the basal side. When these aquaporin channels are embedded on the apical and basal side, that leads to the reabsorption of water. In this way, in response to dehydration or increased osmolarity inside the body, the antidiuretic hormone is going to increase the reabsorption of water from the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and the collecting ducts. Okay, what happens that whenever there is abnormal secretion of antidiuretic hormone? It's very simple to understand that when the levels of antidiuretic hormone increases abnormally inside the body, definitely it is going to reabsorb more and more water from the kidneys. So increased reabsorption of water will lead to decrease in osmolarity of the plasma. The concentration of sodium is going to decrease. So remember, abnormal increased levels of antidiuretic hormone, more reabsorption of water, plasma osmolarity is going to fall because of decreased levels of sodium or decreased concentration of sodium. The opposite is going to happen when the levels of ADH falls in the body, when the levels of antidiuretic hormone decreases in the body. That leads to less reabsorption of water. When there is less reabsorption of water, there will be more urine formation, that is called as polyuria. The specific gravity of urine is going to fall because of more water content, and because of less reabsorption of water, the plasma osmolarity is going to increase, because now we have a state of dehydration. Osmolarity increases because of increased concentration of solutes and less water. So the decrease fall in the levels of ADH can occur in two states. Number one, we call the whole condition is called as diabetes insipidus, and it is of two types. One is called central and the other is called nephrogenic. So in central diabetes insipidus, what happens that there is decreased secretion of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. There is some defect at the level of the posterior pituitary that leads to fall in the levels of antidiuretic hormone. Because of less antidiuretic hormone in the plasma, this effect is going to be lost. There is less reabsorption of water and plasma osmolarity increases, while there is polyuria and decrease in specific gravity of the urine. In nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, what happens that the levels of ADH are normal or increase inside the body, but still the effect does not occur because these receptors which are located on these cells are defective. They are not functioning normally. So despite the presence of antidiuretic hormone, this receptor complex is not functioning, so the effects of ADH will not occur, and again the same things are going to happen, that polyuria and increase in plasma osmolarity. So you have to remember, excess ADH secretion is called as syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, and deficient or insufficient ADH secretion is called as diabetes insipidus, which is either central, when ADH is not being secreted from the posterior pituitary or not being formed from the hypothalamus, and then we have the nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, in which we have defective ADH receptors. The next hormone that we will discuss is the atrial natriuretic peptide. As the name indicates, this hormone is going to be released from the atria, and they have a natriuretic effect, means that they are going to increase the secretion of sodium from the kidneys. and peptide. This is a peptide hormone. So let's see how this works. Remember that whenever the blood volume or the blood pressure increases, it is going to exert stretch on the walls of the atria. Whenever the atrial walls are stretched, they are going to release atrial natriuretic peptide or atrial natriuretic factor. Increase in ANP or ANF, this is also called ANF. Increase in ANF leads to the following effects. Number one, it is going to decrease the levels of renin, which further leads to decreased formation of angiotensin II and decreased aldosterone levels. Fall in levels of both these hormones are going to decrease renal reabsorption of sodium. So when there is decreased reabsorption of sodium, that leads to increased secretion or increased loss of sodium from the urine. That's why this is called as natriuretic factor. First important thing was this. Second, atrial natriuretic peptide also increases glomerular filtration rate. Increase in GFR again leads to increased loss of sodium and water through the urine. So ultimately both these factors, because initial change was increase in blood volume or increased blood pressure, the final change will be because of all these effects, the blood volume or the blood pressure is going to come back towards normal. In this way, atrial natriuretic peptide is going to regulate renal reabsorption of sodium and water. To summarize what we have discussed up till now, the regulation of tubular reabsorption and secretion depends on the glomerulotubular balance that happens at the level of the glomerulus and the peritubular capillaries. Then we have the peritubular physical forces, which are the force turning forces acting across the peritubular capillaries. Then we discuss the roles of hormones: aldosterone, angiotensin II, antidiuretic hormone, atrial natriuretic factor. The last hormone over here is parathyroid hormone. Remember, parathyroid hormone is going to act on the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, and the thick ascending limb of loop of Henle. On the proximal convoluted tubule, it is going to increase the secretion of phosphate, while on the thick ascending limb and on the distal convoluted tubule, it is going to cause more and more reabsorption of calcium ions. This effect of sympathetic nervous system is, you all know very well that it is going to cause vasoconstriction. So it is also going to cause constriction at the levels of the vessels of renal system. So because of increased vasoconstriction, the renal blood flow is going to decrease. Okay. Then we have the arterial pressure. Whenever the arterial pressure increases, the hydrostatic pressure at the level of glomeruli also increases, affecting the renal tubular reabsorption and secretion. Then we have the osmotic factors. Remember that the reabsorption of water across renal tubules depends on the concentration of solutes. Whenever the concentration of solutes in the tubular lumen is more, water is going to be excreted. And whenever the concentration of solutes in the tubular cells and the interstitium is more and more water is going to be reabsorbed. So if the solutes are not reabsorbed from the tubular lumen, if there are more solutes, like if there is more glucose or more electrolytes in the tubular lumen, then water will remain inside the tubular lumen because of osmotic effect, and this excess water is then going to be eliminated from the body. This is called as osmotic diuresis. So all these factors are going to affect the tubular reabsorption and secretion. Hope it is clear to all of you.